In the sweltering autumn of 1848, when Charleston, South Carolina still reigned as one of the wealthiest cities in the American South, its prosperity built entirely on the backs of enslaved human beings who picked cotton and rice under a merciless sun, there existed a young man whose very existence challenged every scientific assumption about race, intelligence, and human capability that white society had constructed to justify its brutal system of oppression. His name was Elias Brooks, and at 20 years old, he could perform mathematical calculations in his head that took trained professors with pencil and paper 10 minutes to verify, could recite entire texts after reading them once, could speak 4 languages fluently, despite never having received formal instruction in any of them, could compose music that made hardened overseers weep, despite never having touched a piano until age 15, and could diagnose illnesses with an accuracy that surpassed most trained physicians of his era. He was, by any objective measure, a genius of the highest order, a prodigy whose intellectual gifts would have made him famous and celebrated in any civilized society. But Elias Brooks was black, and he was enslaved. And those two facts meant that his extraordinary abilities were not celebrated but rather feared, studied, exploited, and ultimately used as justification for horrific experiments that would reveal not the limitations of the enslaved, but rather the moral bankruptcy of those who claimed superiority over them. Before 1848 ends, Elias Brooks will become the subject of scientific experiments designed to prove black inferiority, but which instead expose the lie at slavery's foundation, proving that genius knows no color and that the real monsters aren't the enslaved, but those who enslave them. So subscribe now to witness this incredible true story of brilliance trapped in bondage. Like if you're ready to see how one man's mind defied an entire system built on lies. And comment what you think really happened to Elias, because his fate reveals truths that 1848 America desperately wanted to hide. Elias had been born on the Whitmore plantation 20 miles outside Charleston, the son of Sarah Brooks, a house slave who'd been forced into the master's bed when she was barely 15, and who died giving birth to the child that resulted from that rape. The plantation owner, Colonel Augustus Whitmore, had never acknowledged paternity publicly. That would have been scandalous in a society obsessed with maintaining the fiction of white racial purity, but everyone on the plantation knew the truth, because Elias bore an unmistakable resemblance to the colonel, particularly around the eyes and the shape of his jaw. Being the master's bastard son afforded Elias no special privileges in childhood. He was put to work in the fields at age 6 like any other slave child, expected to pick cotton until his small hands bled, to accept beatings for being too slow or too tired, to watch other children get sold away from their families, and understand that the same fate could befall him at any moment. But even as a child, Elias demonstrated abilities that set him apart. He could count bales of cotton faster than the overseers, never making an error, and when one of the plantation bookkeepers made a calculation mistake that would have cost Colonel Whitmore several $100s, 8-year-old Elias spotted it immediately, though he had the good sense not to speak up publicly, because correcting white people was a quick way to get whipped or worse. The bookkeeper, a shrewd man named Thornton, who actually cared more about accuracy than pride, had noticed the child watching and pulled him aside later, asking how he'd known the numbers were wrong. Elias had explained the calculation in terms so clear and sophisticated that Thornton was stunned, and he'd reported this to Colonel Whitmore not as a curiosity, but as a potential asset. The colonel could have a savant on his property, someone whose abilities might be profitable if properly exploited. Whitmore, initially skeptical that a Negro child could possess genuine intelligence rather than mere animal cleverness, had tested Elias himself with increasingly complex mathematical problems, and when the boy solved them all without hesitation, the colonel's skepticism transformed into something more dangerous, scientific curiosity mixed with financial opportunism. He pulled Elias from fieldwork and began a strange sort of education, teaching him to read and write and calculate, activities that were illegal in South Carolina, where laws explicitly forbade educating slaves for fear that literacy would make them harder to control. But Colonel Whitmore rationalized this violation by telling himself he wasn't really educating a slave so much as training an animal to perform tricks, like teaching a dog to fetch or a horse to count by stamping hooves. The next 12 years of Elias's life were a bizarre mixture of intellectual stimulation and dehumanizing exploitation. Colonel Whitmore would invite Charleston's educated elite to the plantation for dinner parties, where the main entertainment was watching Elias solve mathematical problems, translate Latin texts, or play complex musical compositions on the piano after hearing them once. These white gentlemen would applaud and marvel, some genuinely impressed, others deeply unsettled by abilities that challenged their fundamental beliefs about racial hierarchy. Doctors and phrenologists, the pseudo-scientists of the era who claimed they could measure intelligence and character by examining skull shapes, begged for permission to study Elias, to measure his head and poke at his brain, to determine whether his abilities represented some genetic anomaly or whether they might indicate that the scientific justifications for slavery were perhaps not as solid as previously believed. Colonel Whitmore allowed these examinations because they brought him prestige and because he charged substantial fees for access to his remarkable property. But he always insisted that Elias's gifts proved nothing about the Negro race as a whole, that he was merely an exception that proved the rule, a freak of nature no more significant than a two-headed calf or a chicken that could play dead. Elias endured these humiliations with outward compliance but inner rage, understanding that any resistance would mean being sold to a crueler master or simply killed, that his extraordinary mind was both his greatest asset and his most terrible burden. He lived in a strange liminal space, neither field slave nor house slave, treated sometimes almost like a family member when the colonel wanted to show him off, but reminded constantly of his true status through casual cruelties and absolute lack of freedom. He wasn't allowed to choose his own clothes, his own food, his own company. He couldn't leave the plantation without permission. He couldn't marry the woman he loved, a fellow slave named Celia who worked in the kitchen, because Colonel Whitmore forbade it, claiming that Elias's special nature made normal domestic arrangements inappropriate, though the real reason was that the colonel enjoyed exerting total control over every aspect of Elias's existence and didn't want him finding comfort or strength in human connection. At night, alone in the tiny room above the carriage house where he was kept, Elias would lie awake and use his perfect memory to recite abolitionist texts he'd glimpsed in visitors' bags, speeches by Frederick Douglass that someone had carelessly left on a table, passages from the Declaration of Independence about all men being created equal, words that white America proclaimed loudly while systematically denying them to millions of black people. Everything changed in the spring of 1848 when Dr. Josiah Nott arrived from Mobile, Alabama, a physician and anthropologist who'd made his name propounding theories of polygenesis, the pseudo-scientific claim that different races were actually different species, that black people were inherently and biologically inferior to whites, that slavery wasn't a moral failing, but rather a natural arrangement reflecting genuine differences in capability and deserved hierarchy. Dr. Nott had heard about Elias Brooks and was deeply troubled by reports of his abilities, which, if true, would undermine theories Nott had spent years developing and publishing in medical journals and popular books. He came to the Whitmore plantation determined to prove that Elias's gifts were either exaggerated or could be explained in ways that didn't challenge racial hierarchy. Perhaps the young man had white ancestry that explained his intelligence, or perhaps he was merely parroting information without genuine comprehension, or perhaps his abilities existed in such narrow domains that they didn't represent true intelligence at all. Colonel Whitmore, always eager for attention and profit, welcomed Dr. Nott enthusiastically and agreed to let him conduct a thorough examination of Elias, including physical measurements, psychological tests, and, if necessary, more invasive procedures that the colonel didn't want to think about too carefully, but which Dr. Nott assured him were standard scientific practice. The examination began cordially enough in Colonel Whitmore's study, with Dr. Nott asking Elias a series of questions designed to test his knowledge across multiple domains: mathematics, languages, history, natural philosophy, music theory. Elias answered them all flawlessly, his responses so sophisticated that even Dr. Nott had to consult reference books to verify their accuracy. The doctor then moved to physical examination, measuring Elias's skull with calipers, noting the dimensions and ratios, comparing them to charts he'd developed, supposedly demonstrating cranial differences between races. But the measurements didn't support Nott's theories. Elias's skull proportions were unremarkable, indistinguishable from those of white men Nott had examined, offering no physical explanation for his extraordinary mental abilities. Frustrated, Dr. Nott began asking more personal questions about Elias's childhood, his parents, trying to establish that perhaps there was more white ancestry than Colonel Whitmore admitted. But Elias refused to cooperate with this line of inquiry, responding with polite but firm refusals to speculate about matters he considered private. This defiance infuriated Dr. Knott, who wasn't accustomed to having Negroes, even remarkable ones, refuse to answer his questions, and he complained to Colonel Whitmore that the examination couldn't be completed properly if the subject wasn't fully compliant. Colonel Whitmore's response revealed the fundamental cruelty at the heart of their arrangement. He told Dr. Knott to proceed with whatever methods he deemed necessary, that Elias would cooperate or face severe consequences, that this was too important a scientific opportunity to let a slave's feelings interfere. The next phase of the examination took place in the plantation's medical building, a structure ostensibly used for treating sick slaves, but which also served as a site for experimental procedures that no ethical physician would have conducted on free patients. Dr. Knott brought in colleagues from Charleston Medical College, and together they subjected Elias to a battery of tests that grew progressively more invasive and painful, drawing blood samples, administering drugs that affected his consciousness and cognitive function, using electrical stimulation on his brain to see if they could disrupt or enhance his abilities. Procedures that crossed every ethical line, but which were considered acceptable when performed on enslaved people, who legally had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Elias endured this with stoic dignity, answering their questions even through pain and drugged confusion, performing mathematical calculations while electrodes sent shocks through his temples, reciting poetry, while his blood was being drained into collection jars, maintaining his humanity even as the men who claimed to be his biological superiors treated him like a laboratory animal. But what Dr. Knott and his colleagues discovered terrified them more than any result they'd anticipated. Every test demonstrated that Elias's cognitive abilities didn't just match those of educated white men, they surpassed them. His reaction times were faster, his memory more perfect, his capacity for complex reasoning more sophisticated, his linguistic abilities more nuanced. The drugs that were supposed to impair his thinking barely affected him, as if his brain compensated automatically for chemical interference. The electrical stimulation that should have disrupted his cognitive function instead seemed to enhance it temporarily, allowing him to solve problems even faster than usual. There was no physical abnormality in his brain structure, no obvious difference that explained his gifts, except the uncomfortable conclusion that perhaps, just perhaps, the entire edifice of racial pseudoscience was built on lies, that intelligence had nothing to do with skull shape or skin color, that Elias Brooks was proof that black people, given the same opportunities as whites, could achieve the same or greater heights of intellectual accomplishment. This realization should have led to soul-searching, to questioning the moral foundation of slavery, to scientific integrity, demanding they publish findings that challenged prevailing theories. Instead, it led to something far darker, a decision to suppress the evidence and eliminate the source of their cognitive dissonance through methods that would ensure Elias Brooks never challenged racial hierarchy again. Dr. Knott convened a private meeting with Colonel Whitmore and his colleagues from Charleston Medical College in the plantation's library, away from the prying ears of household slaves who might overhear and spread word of what was being discussed. The men sat in leather chairs, surrounded by books that most of them had never actually read, drinking brandy and smoking cigars while they contemplated what to do about the problem of Elias Brooks. Dr. Knott spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, explaining that the results of their examination were unambiguous and deeply troubling. Elias demonstrated cognitive abilities that not only matched but exceeded those of educated white men, and there was no physical abnormality that explained this discrepancy, no skull malformation or brain structure difference that would allow them to categorize him as a freak rather than a representative sample of Negro potential. One of the other physicians, Dr. Hammond from Charleston, suggested that perhaps they should simply publish their findings honestly, that science demanded truth even when truth was uncomfortable, that maybe the implications for racial theory and slavery needed to be confronted rather than suppressed. The room fell silent after this suggestion, all eyes turning to Dr. Hammond with expressions ranging from shock to contempt, and Dr. Knott finally broke the silence by asking whether Hammond understood what he was proposing, that they destroy their own careers, discredit years of research, provide ammunition to abolitionists who were already making life difficult, with their constant moral hectoring, and potentially undermine the entire economic system of the South, which depended on maintaining the fiction that Negroes were naturally suited for slavery due to inherent intellectual and moral deficiencies. Colonel Whitmore, who had the most direct financial stake in maintaining slavery, was even more blunt. He reminded them that Elias was his property, worth perhaps $2,000 on the open market, but worth much more as an attraction that brought prominent visitors to the plantation and enhanced the colonel's reputation as a man of scientific curiosity. But if word spread about the true results of their examination, if it became known that an enslaved Negro could outthink white professors, the implications would be catastrophic, not just for the colonel's property values, but for the entire social order of the South. Slaves would start getting ideas about their own potential, about demanding education and rights. Abolitionists would seize on Elias as proof that black people deserved freedom and equality. The careful arguments that Southern intellectuals had constructed over decades, arguments based on supposed scientific evidence of racial differences in skull size, brain capacity, moral development, would collapse like a house of cards. And then, what would happen? Without the ideological justification that slavery was natural and beneficial for an inferior race, the institution would be revealed for what it truly was: systematic kidnapping, rape, torture and murder undertaken for economic profit. The colonel suggested that there was really only one solution to their dilemma. Elias Brooks needed to disappear, and the results of their examination needed to be modified in their official reports to show what they should have shown, what everyone expected them to show, what was necessary to maintain the racial theories that justified slavery. Dr. Hammond protested weakly that this would be scientific fraud, but the other men in the room stared at him with expressions that made clear his choices were to cooperate or face social and professional ostracism from the tight-knit community of Southern intellectuals. Elias, of course, knew none of this was happening. He'd been returned to his room above the carriage house after the final day of examinations, his body aching from the invasive procedures, his mind reeling from the drugs they'd administered, but still functioning well enough to understand that something had shifted in how the doctors looked at him during those final tests. He'd seen fear in their eyes, and anger, and something else he couldn't quite identify, but which made his skin crawl, a kind of cold calculation that suggested they were making decisions about his fate that had nothing to do with science or truth, and everything to do with maintaining their power and privilege. He tried to find Celia, the woman he loved, who worked in the plantation kitchen, but was told by another slave that Colonel Whitmore had given orders that Elias was to remain in his room and speak to no one until further notice. This isolation worried him more than the physical pain of the examinations, because it suggested they were planning something they didn't want witnesses to, something that required keeping him away from the other slaves who might notice if he disappeared, or who might spread word if something happened to him. He spent that night lying awake, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into darkness, and using his perfect memory to review everything he'd observed during the examinations, the doctor's questions that seemed designed to trip him up, the increasing frustration when he answered correctly every time, the whispered conversations they thought he couldn't hear, but which his extraordinary hearing had caught perfectly, conversations about unexpected results and problematic implications and necessary measures. The next morning, Colonel Whitmore came to Elias's room personally, something he rarely did, and told him to pack his few belongings because he was being sent to Charleston for additional examinations at the medical college, where more sophisticated equipment and expertise were available. Elias felt ice water run through his veins because he understood immediately that this was a lie, that whatever they had planned for him wouldn't happen in Charleston, where there might be witnesses or records, but rather somewhere isolated, where screams wouldn't be heard and bodies could disappear without questions being asked. But he also understood that refusing or resisting would only accelerate whatever fate they had planned. So he nodded meekly and gathered his things: a spare shirt, a book of poetry that Colonel Whitmore had once given him as a reward for a particularly impressive display of memorization, and a small carved wooden bird that Celia had made for him years ago, the only physical reminder he had of her love. As he was being led to a covered wagon, he managed to catch the eye of an older slave named Jacob, who worked in the stables, and in that brief moment of eye contact, he tried to convey everything he couldn't say aloud: that he was in danger, that someone needed to tell Celia what was happening, that if he didn't return, she should know he'd been thinking of her at the end. Jacob gave an almost imperceptible nod, and Elias felt a small measure of comfort, knowing that at least someone would remember him, would know that he hadn't just run away or been sold, that whatever happened to him was not his choice. The wagon ride took 3 hours, but they didn't go to Charleston. Instead, they traveled to a remote property the colonel owned on one of the Sea Islands, a place that had once been used as a quarantine station for incoming slave ships, where Africans who'd survived the Middle Passage would be held until they were healthy enough to sell, and where those who died from disease or despair would be buried in unmarked graves that the tide would eventually wash away. The buildings were mostly abandoned now, crumbling structures surrounded by salt marsh and accessible only by boat or by the treacherous dirt road they'd just traveled. Dr. Knott was waiting there, along with 2 men Elias didn't recognize, rough-looking whites who had the bearing of overseers or slave catchers, men whose moral flexibility could be purchased for the right price. The doctor explained in a tone one might use to discuss dinner plans that they were going to conduct a final series of examinations, more thorough than what had been possible at the plantation, procedures that would settle once and for all the questions about Elias's unusual abilities. But the way he said it, the cold clinical detachment in his voice, made clear that these weren't going to be examinations designed to learn anything new. These were going to be procedures designed to destroy what they'd already learned, to eliminate the evidence that challenged their theories, to make sure that Elias Brooks could never again demonstrate abilities that undermined the scientific justifications for slavery. They took him into one of the larger buildings, a structure that might have been a hospital or processing center when the quarantine station was active, now dusty and filled with old equipment and the smell of decay. They strapped him to a table, not gently, not apologetically, but with casual brutality that made clear he was no longer even pretending to be anything other than property being prepared for disposal. Dr. Knott explained, almost conversationally, that he was going to perform a procedure called trepanation, drilling holes into Elias's skull to access his brain directly, ostensibly to examine the tissue and determine what physical abnormalities might explain his abilities. But Elias knew, with the terrible clarity that his extraordinary mind provided, that this was execution disguised as science, that no one survived having their skull drilled open by a doctor who viewed them as a problem to be solved, rather than a human being to be healed. He tried to speak, tried to use the rhetorical abilities that had impressed so many white audiences, tried to argue for his life using logic and reason and appeals to basic human decency. But Dr. Knott just shook his head and said that Elias's intelligence was precisely the problem, that he'd become too dangerous to live, that his mere existence threatened an entire way of life that Knott and men like him had built their careers and fortunes defending. The doctor administered a dose of chloroform, not enough to render Elias unconscious, because he wanted the subject alert enough to respond to questions during the procedure, but enough to dull the pain and make resistance impossible. As Elias felt his muscles relax against his will, as he felt the steel bit of the surgical drill touch his scalp, he used his final moments of clear consciousness to do what his mind did best, to calculate and remember, and testify. He began reciting aloud, in a voice made dreamy by the anesthetic, everything he'd learned during his 20 years of life, all the poetry and mathematics and music and languages, all the evidence of human potential that his masters wanted to erase, speaking it into existence one final time as an act of defiance that no amount of drilling could fully destroy. But something happened that no one in that room expected. As the drill bit penetrated Elias's skull and Dr. Knott began the delicate process of accessing brain tissue, there was a sudden violent convulsion, not from Elias but from the equipment itself. The drill jerked in Knott's hand, wrenching itself free and clattering across the floor. The leather straps holding Elias began to smoke and char, as if touched by invisible fire. The 2 hired men stepped back nervously, one of them crossing himself and muttering about witchcraft, while Dr. Knott tried to maintain his clinical composure and reached for the drill again. But before he could touch it, Elias's eyes snapped open, not the half-lidded drugged gaze that should have been there under chloroform, but fully awake, burning with an intelligence that seemed almost supernaturally focused, and he spoke in a voice that sounded like his own, but deeper, resonant, as if multiple voices were speaking through him at once. He said that they could kill his body, but they couldn't kill what he represented. That truth had a way of surviving, even when those who spoke it did not, that the lies they told themselves about racial superiority would eventually collapse under the weight of evidence, no matter how many brilliant black minds they tried to destroy. He said he wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last, that there were and would be thousands like him, millions like him, people whose abilities gave lie to every comfortable fiction white supremacy had constructed. And then he told them something that made even Dr. Knott's scientific rationalism falter. He described in perfect detail the contents of private conversations the doctor had had with colleagues, letters he'd written, thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, as if Elias could somehow see into his mind, could access knowledge that no normal examination could have provided. Dr. Knott stumbled backward, genuinely frightened now, wondering if the abolitionists were right when they spoke of slavery as a sin that would bring divine judgment, wondering if this young man strapped to his table might be an instrument of that judgment, a living condemnation of every evil thing Knott had done in the name of science and racial hierarchy. The moment passed. The supernatural intensity faded from Elias's eyes, replaced by the exhausted resignation of someone who knew he was about to die and had made peace with it. Dr. Knott, recovering his composure and his commitment to the course of action he'd chosen, retrieved the drill and completed the procedure despite trembling hands, despite the way the lights in the room seemed to flicker and dim, despite the oppressive feeling that they were being watched by invisible witnesses who would remember this crime long after everyone present had turned to dust. The trepanation was fatal, as intended, though the official record would show that Elias Brooks died of a sudden fever, tragic but not uncommon for Negroes, who were understood to be more susceptible to disease than their white counterparts. His body was buried in the marshland, in one of those unmarked graves where so many other enslaved people had been laid to rest without ceremony or acknowledgement, and the truth about what had been done to him remained hidden for over a century, surfacing only through fragments of letters and coded diary entries that historians would eventually piece together into a story that demanded to be told, a testament to genius destroyed by those who couldn't bear to acknowledge what it revealed about their own moral bankruptcy. But death was not the end of Elias Brooks's story, at least not the end of his influence on the world that had tried so hard to silence him. In the days immediately following his murder, disguised as a medical procedure, and then covered up as natural death from fever, strange things began happening on the Whitmore plantation that couldn't be explained by rational means, and which made even the most skeptical overseers cross themselves and mutter prayers. The first incident occurred in Colonel Whitmore's study, where he kept his account books and correspondence. One morning he found every book on his shelves open to passages about slavery's moral evil, abolitionists' arguments, philosophical treatises on human equality, texts he owned but had never read. Positioned now so he couldn't avoid seeing them, he dismissed it as a prank by house slaves and had them all whipped. But the next morning, it happened again, and this time the books were stacked to spell out "Remember Elias" in a way that couldn't have been coincidental. Dr. Knott, who'd returned to Mobile, began experiencing terrible nightmares, visions of Elias speaking to him with that same supernatural intensity he'd displayed on the operating table, reciting scientific truths about human potential and racial equality, describing experiments Knott had conducted or planned to conduct, exposing every lie the doctor had told himself to justify his complicity in slavery. The nightmares grew so severe that Knott stopped sleeping entirely, dosing himself with laudanum and brandy to dull his consciousness, and when that stopped working, he turned to more dangerous opiates, beginning a spiral into addiction that would destroy his medical career within 5 years. Celia, the woman Elias had loved, learned of his death from Jacob, the stable hand who'd witnessed their final exchange of looks. She'd been waiting for news, growing increasingly desperate as days turned into weeks with no word, and when Jacob finally told her what he'd seen, the wagon taking Elias away, the direction they'd traveled, the way Elias had looked back with eyes that said goodbye, she knew with terrible certainty that he was gone. She grieved the way enslaved people had to grieve, silently and without the luxury of time to process loss, continuing to work in the kitchen while her heart broke, knowing that showing too much sadness might raise questions about their relationship that could get her sold, or worse. But at night, in the quarters she shared with other house slaves, she would lie awake and remember everything about him, his voice reciting poetry in languages she didn't understand, but found beautiful anyway, his rare smiles when they'd stolen moments together, his hands that could solve mathematical problems and also hold her face with infinite gentleness, his dreams of freedom that they'd whispered about in darkness, imagining impossible futures where they might marry and have children and live as human beings rather than property. She kept the wooden bird he'd treasured, the one she'd carved for him, found among his few possessions that Colonel Whitmore had ordered cleared from his room, and she held it while she slept, a talisman connecting her to a man whose brilliance had made him dangerous to those who needed to believe black people were inferior. The other slaves on the Whitmore plantation had always known Elias was special, had taken pride in his abilities even as they understood those same abilities made him vulnerable. Now, with him gone under suspicious circumstances that the colonel claimed were natural, but which too many details contradicted, a quiet rage began building in the quarters. It wasn't the kind of rage that expressed itself in immediate violence. Enslaved people knew better than to strike directly at their oppressors when the full force of law and custom would descend on them in response, but rather a slow-burning anger that manifested in small acts of resistance and sabotage that white overseers attributed to laziness or incompetence, but which were actually calculated attempts to cost the colonel money and trouble. Tools went missing or broke at crucial moments. Cotton bales were miscounted in ways that always favored the slaves and cost the master. Work songs that had always been spirituals about heaven and salvation took on new verses with coded references to justice and vengeance and debts that would be paid even if payment took generations. One verse that spread rapidly through multiple plantations went, "Brother Elias knows the number, counts every crime and every theft. Brilliant mind they couldn't plunder, living still though they stopped his breath." The white overseers who heard it thought it was just more Negro superstition about ghosts and ancestors, not understanding that it was actually a form of historical record-keeping, a way of ensuring that Elias's story would survive, even if official records buried it, that future generations would know a genius had lived and been murdered for threatening the lies that slavery depended on. Meanwhile, the scientific papers that Dr. Knott and his colleagues eventually published about their examination of Elias Brooks told a story very different from what they'd actually discovered. The official version claimed that while Elias demonstrated certain savant-like abilities, rapid calculation, prodigious memory, these were essentially mechanical skills that existed in isolation, unconnected to genuine intelligence or moral reasoning. The papers argued that his brain showed structural abnormalities consistent with the kind of idiot savant syndrome sometimes observed in white patients, and that far from challenging racial theories, his case actually confirmed them by demonstrating that any apparent Negro intelligence was merely mimicry or specialized skill rather than true cognitive capacity. These fraudulent findings were cited for decades in medical journals and anthropology texts used to justify slavery and later segregation, referenced by generations of racist pseudo-scientists who needed evidence that black people were inherently inferior. The truth, that Elias had demonstrated abilities surpassing most educated whites, that his brain structure was normal, that the doctors had found no physical explanation for his genius except the uncomfortable conclusion that genius had nothing to do with race, remained hidden in private correspondence and coded journal entries that wouldn't be discovered and decoded until the late 20th century, long after everyone involved was dead and beyond earthly judgment. But some truths have a way of surviving even deliberate suppression. In 1850, 2 years after Elias's death, Frederick Douglass published an expanded version of his autobiography that included a passage about meeting a young enslaved man in Charleston who could solve complex mathematical problems and speak multiple languages, a man whose existence proved that claims about Negro intellectual inferiority were lies designed to justify theft and murder. Douglass never named Elias explicitly, perhaps because he'd been asked not to by sources who feared retaliation, but anyone familiar with the story would have recognized the reference. The passage was republished in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, sparking debates about the nature of intelligence and whether slavery could be justified if enslaved people proved themselves capable of the same intellectual achievements as their masters. Southern newspapers responded with fury, publishing rebuttals that claimed Douglass was lying or exaggerating, that such a person had never existed, that even if he had existed, his abilities proved nothing, because exceptions didn't invalidate general rules about racial hierarchy. But the seed of doubt had been planted, the idea introduced that maybe, just maybe, the entire edifice of scientific racism was built on lies that would crumble if exposed to honest examination. Harriet Beecher Stowe, researching what would become Uncle Tom's Cabin, heard a version of Elias's story from a Charleston abolitionist who'd been present at one of Colonel Whitmore's exhibitions of his remarkable property. She incorporated elements of it into her novel, creating a character who was brilliant and enslaved, whose intelligence made him more rather than less threatening, to masters who needed to believe their victims were subhuman. When the novel was published in 1852 and became an international sensation, helping to radicalize Northern opinion against slavery, one of the elements that struck readers most powerfully was this demonstration that enslaved people were fully human, fully capable, denied education and opportunity not because they lacked potential, but because their oppressors feared what they might achieve if given freedom. Southern critics attacked this aspect of the novel as unrealistic, as pandering to Northern sentimentality, but former slaves who'd managed to escape North wrote to Stowe confirming that they'd known people like her fictional character, that brilliance existed in the quarters just as surely as it existed in the big houses, that slavery destroyed not just bodies, but also minds that might otherwise have advanced human knowledge and culture in ways the world would never know, because they'd been systematically crushed by a system that could only maintain itself through deliberate ignorance and violence. Colonel Whitmore died in 1855, 7 years after Elias, of a stroke that left him paralyzed and unable to speak for the 6 months before his heart finally gave out. During those months, enslaved people who cared for him reported that he seemed terrified of something they couldn't see, that his eyes would track movement across empty rooms, that he would make choking sounds as if being strangled by invisible hands, that he seemed to be trying to form words that wouldn't come, perhaps apologies, perhaps confessions, perhaps just screaming at visions of a young man whose genius he'd exploited and whose murder he'd ordered. His death was seen by the enslaved community as divine justice, proof that some crimes couldn't escape punishment even when human laws failed to provide it. Celia, still working on the plantation, still keeping the wooden bird hidden in her quarters, allowed herself a small smile when she heard the colonel was dead, and she whispered to that carved bird that maybe, finally, Elias could rest. But in her heart she knew that what had been done to him, the systematic destruction of brilliance, the scientific fraud, the murder disguised as medicine, represented a crime so vast that no single death could balance the scales. That justice would require not just punishment for individuals, but the complete dismantling of the system that had made such atrocities possible and even legal. The Civil War came less than a decade later, bringing with it the destruction of slavery that abolitionists had fought for and that enslaved people had resisted toward through countless acts of courage and defiance. When Union troops finally marched into Charleston in 1865 and enslaved people were told they were free, Celia was 63 years old, her body worn down by decades of forced labor, but her spirit still intact. She walked off the Whitmore plantation, carrying nothing but the wooden bird and her memories, and she made her way to one of the freed people's schools that Northern missionaries were establishing throughout the South. There she learned to read and write, skills that had been denied her during slavery, and she wrote down everything she could remember about Elias, his brilliance, his kindness, the way Colonel Whitmore and Dr. Knott had murdered him for being too smart, too human, too dangerous to the lives that slavery depended on. Her handwritten account, deposited with a church archive, would survive into the 21st century, becoming one of the key pieces of evidence that historians use to reconstruct Elias Brooks's story and finally give him the recognition that 1848 had denied him, recognition as a genius, a martyr, and a testament to the truth that human potential knows no race and that any system requiring lies and murder to maintain itself is destined for the ash heap of history. In 1848, Elias Brooks proved that enslaved people could be geniuses, but white scientists murdered him and buried the evidence because the truth threatened everything slavery was built on, showing that the real savages weren't those held in bondage, but those who held them. Subscribe to hear more hidden stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about American history. Like if this story of brilliance and betrayal moved you, comment what you think should be done to honor Elias's memory today, and share, because these are the stories that textbooks tried to erase, but which refused to stay buried. The rediscovery of Elias Brooks's story in modern times came not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the patient, painstaking work of historians who spent decades piecing together fragments from archives that had been designed to erase rather than preserve the truth about slavery's brutalities. In 1964, a graduate student at Howard University named Patricia Montgomery was researching medical experimentation on enslaved people for her dissertation when she stumbled across a cryptic reference in a letter written by a Charleston physician in 1850. The letter mentioned the unfortunate Brooks matter and cautioned a colleague against publishing certain findings that might provide ammunition to abolitionists and undermine our scientific credibility. The phrase was vague enough that Montgomery almost dismissed it, but something about the wording, the combination of a proper name with the suggestion of suppressed scientific data, made her dig deeper. She spent the next 3 years tracking down every reference to anyone named Brooks in Charleston medical circles during the 1840s and 1850s, cross-referencing plantation records, newspaper obituaries, private correspondence, and medical journal publications. What she eventually uncovered was a conspiracy of silence so thorough that it had successfully hidden Elias's existence from historical record for over a century, and a story so horrifying that her dissertation committee initially suggested she must be mistaken, that surely no respected physicians would have committed the crime she was describing. But Montgomery was not mistaken. She'd found Dr. Josiah Nott's private journals, donated to a medical archive by descendants who had no idea what they contained, and in those journals, Nott had written with shocking candor about the examination of a Negro savant of remarkable abilities, whose cognitive testing had produced results incompatible with accepted theories of racial capacity. The journals described the decision to suppress these findings and detailed in clinical language that made the horror somehow worse the trepanation procedure that had ended Elias's life. Montgomery found corroborating evidence in Colonel Whitmore's plantation records, which showed a slave named Elias Brooks, who'd been valued at an unusually high $3,000, extraordinary for field labor, but consistent with someone whose abilities made him a profitable attraction. She found the falsified death certificate listing cause of death as brain fever, signed by a doctor who'd been present at the actual murder. And, most importantly, she found Celia's handwritten account, stored in a church archive in Charleston, which provided the human context that the medical records stripped away, the story of a man who'd been loved and murdered, whose brilliance had threatened a system built on the premise that people like him couldn't exist, whose death had been covered up, because acknowledging what he'd achieved would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of slavery. Montgomery's dissertation, published in 1967 at the height of the civil rights movement, caused a sensation. The Elias Brooks story became a powerful tool in contemporary debates about race and intelligence, offering historical proof that claims about black intellectual inferiority had always been lies. That the scientific establishment had been complicit in perpetuating these lies, that what segregationists claimed was natural racial hierarchy was actually the result of systematic denial of opportunity backed by violence. The story resonated particularly strongly with black Americans who'd grown up being told they were naturally less intelligent than whites, who'd attended underfunded schools with outdated textbooks, while being blamed for their own educational failures, who'd been subjected to biased IQ tests designed to confirm predetermined conclusions about their cognitive limitations. Here was evidence that a century earlier an enslaved black man had demonstrated abilities that surpassed those of his supposed masters, and that those masters had murdered him rather than acknowledge what his existence meant for their theories of racial superiority. Conservative academics tried to discredit Montgomery's research, suggesting she'd misinterpreted the sources or fallen victim to wishful thinking, but the documentary evidence was too strong and too carefully assembled to dismiss. Elias Brooks had existed, had been extraordinary, and had been killed specifically because his extraordinary nature contradicted the lies that justified slavery. The publicity surrounding Montgomery's dissertation led to additional discoveries. In 1969, a descendant of Dr. Samuel Hammond, the physician who'd briefly suggested publishing the truthful findings about Elias's examination, came forward with a box of letters she'd found in her grandmother's attic. Hammond had apparently struggled with guilt about his complicity in the cover-up and had written extensively to his wife about the moral compromise he'd made, choosing professional advancement over scientific integrity. One letter described Elias in heartbreaking detail. "He is the gentlest soul, the most brilliant mind I have encountered in 20 years of medical practice, and we are about to destroy him, because his excellence threatens our comfortable myths about our own superiority. God will judge us harshly for this, and rightly so. I have sold my conscience for the price of maintaining my practice and my social standing, and I do not know how I will live with that knowledge." Hammond had died young at age 43 in 1852, possibly by his own hand, The death certificate listed accidental overdose of laudanum, but family oral history suggested it was deliberate, that he'd been unable to bear the weight of what he'd participated in. These letters provided emotional context that the clinical records lacked, showing that even some participants in Elias's murder had recognized its evil, had understood they were destroying something precious and irreplaceable, but had lacked the courage to resist the social and professional pressures that demanded compliance with racial hierarchy. The Elias Brooks story took on new life in the 1970s and 1980s as Black studies programs at universities began incorporating it into curricula as an example of how white supremacy operated, not just through overt violence, but also through scientific fraud, through the deliberate suppression of evidence that challenged racist premises. Students wrote papers analyzing the psychology of men like Dr. Knott and Colonel Whitmore, trying to understand how educated people could commit such atrocities and then justify them as necessary for social order. Psychologists used the case to explore how cognitive dissonance operated when reality contradicted deeply held beliefs. The doctors' inability to accept what their own testing revealed, their need to destroy evidence rather than revise theories, their willingness to murder a human being rather than admit they'd been wrong. Bioethicists cited Elias's case when discussing the history of medical experimentation on vulnerable populations, drawing connections between 1848 Charleston and the Tuskegee syphilis study, between trepanation conducted without consent and modern issues of informed consent in human subjects research. The case became a teaching tool for demonstrating how science could be corrupted when placed in service of ideology, how objective inquiry could be subordinated to protecting power structures, how the same institutions that claim to pursue truth could actively suppress it when truth threatened privilege. But perhaps the most powerful impact of rediscovering Elias's story came from the descendants of enslaved people who learned about him and saw their own family histories reflected in his fate. How many other brilliant minds had been destroyed in slavery? People wondered, not murdered as dramatically as Elias, but simply ground down by forced labor, denied education, prevented from developing their gifts, their potential contributions to human knowledge and culture lost forever. The historical record was full of hints. Slaves who'd been gifted musicians despite never having formal training, who'd been skilled engineers capable of designing complex mechanical systems, who'd been poets and storytellers and natural philosophers, whose abilities had been noted by surprised white observers as curiosities rather than recognized as evidence that intelligence was universal rather than racially determined. Elias Brooks became a symbol for all those unnamed geniuses, all that lost potential, all the ways that slavery had impoverished not just black people, but human civilization as a whole by systematically crushing brilliance that happened to appear in the wrong-colored skin. Organizations dedicated to celebrating black achievement and supporting black students began awarding Elias Brooks scholarships to young people pursuing education in science and mathematics. Their deliberate effort to honor his memory by nurturing the kinds of gifts that slavery had tried to destroy. Schools and libraries in predominantly black neighborhoods were named after him, ensuring that children would grow up knowing his name even if broader American history curricula continued to ignore it. In 1998, 150 years after Elias's death, Charleston held a public memorial service, acknowledging what had been done to him and formally apologizing for the complicity of the city's medical and academic establishments in his murder and the subsequent cover-up. The event was controversial. Many white Charlestonians felt it was unnecessary to apologize for crimes committed by long-dead people, while many black Charlestonians felt that a memorial service was insufficient without meaningful reparations for the descendants of enslaved people whose labor had built Charleston's wealth. But the service happened nonetheless, held on the grounds where the old Whitmore plantation had once stood, now a state park. Celia's descendants were present. Patricia Montgomery had tracked them down through church records, and they'd maintained family oral history about their ancestor, who'd loved a genius, who'd been killed by men who feared his mind. They accepted a posthumous honorary doctorate from Charleston Medical College on Elias's behalf, and one of his great-great-great-grandchildren gave a speech saying that the best way to honor Elias's memory wasn't through monuments or ceremonies, but through commitment to truth-telling, to honest science, to educational systems that nurtured rather than crushed potential regardless of where they found it, to dismantling every remaining structure of white supremacy that continued to limit opportunities based on race. The forensic team that had been granted permission to excavate the old quarantine station, where Elias had been buried, never found his remains. A century and a half of coastal erosion had claimed the marshland where he'd been interred, his bones long since scattered by tides and storms. But they found artifacts, medical instruments from the 1840s, including a surgical drill consistent with the type used for trepanation, still bearing traces of bone and blood that DNA testing confirmed as human. They found fragments of a wooden carving near where the graves would have been, possibly a bird, consistent with Celia's account that Elias had treasured such an object, and they found something that stopped the excavation team in their tracks. Dozens of other graves, unmarked and forgotten, belonging to people who'd been used as experimental subjects at the quarantine station, their bones showing evidence of surgical procedures that hadn't been medically necessary, procedures that had clearly been performed without regard for the subject's survival or suffering. Elias hadn't been an isolated victim, but part of a systematic pattern of using enslaved people as human guinea pigs for medical experiments that no ethical physician would have conducted on free patients. The discovery sparked renewed calls for comprehensive investigation into medical crimes committed during slavery, for acknowledgement of how modern medical knowledge had been built in part on evidence gathered through torture and murder, for serious discussion of what contemporary medicine owed to the descendants of people who'd been victimized in the name of scientific progress. Dr. Knott's published papers were formally retracted by medical journals in 2003, over 150 years after they'd been written, with editorial notes explaining that the research had been fraudulent and the conclusions deliberately falsified to support racist ideology. His theories of polygenesis, which had been cited for decades to justify slavery and segregation, were finally officially acknowledged as pseudo-scientific racism rather than legitimate anthropology. Textbooks that had presented his work as important contributions to understanding human racial differences were revised to include context about the fraudulent methodology and ideological motivations behind his claims. But the damage of those theories had already been done. Generations of medical students, anthropologists, psychologists, and policymakers had been trained using materials based on Knott's lies, had absorbed assumptions about racial differences that shaped how they treated patients, designed research studies, and made decisions affecting millions of lives. Correcting false information was important, but it couldn't undo a century and a half of harm caused by the original dissemination of those lies. Today, in the 21st century, Elias Brooks is remembered not as a curiosity or an exception that proved the rule, but as a martyr whose death exposed the fundamental lie at the heart of white supremacy, the claim that racial hierarchy was natural, scientifically justified, and rooted in genuine differences in human capability, rather than in power maintained through violence and systematic denial of opportunity. His story has been incorporated into American history curricula in some school districts, though it remains absent from many textbooks that prefer more comfortable narratives about slavery as a regrettable but ultimately resolved historical episode rather than a system of terror whose ideological foundations continue to poison contemporary society. Students who do learn about Elias often express shock that such a thing could happen, that educated men claiming to pursue scientific truth could murder someone whose existence challenged their theories, rather than revising those theories to accommodate reality. But their teachers point out that this pattern has repeated throughout history. The persecution of Galileo for astronomical observations that contradicted religious doctrine, the suppression of evidence about climate change by those with financial stakes in fossil fuels, the dismissal of women scientists whose findings challenged male-dominated academic hierarchies. The specific details change, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. When evidence contradicts power, those who benefit from existing arrangements will often choose to destroy the evidence rather than relinquish their privilege. The psychological and sociological research inspired by Elias's case has been extensive. Scholars have analyzed why brilliant enslaved people were particularly threatening to slavery's ideological foundations, more threatening in some ways than physical rebellion, because rebellion could be framed as animal violence requiring suppression, while intellectual achievement forced acknowledgement of the enslaved as fully human, as people whose subjugation couldn't be justified by claims of natural inferiority. Studies have examined how white Southerners maintained belief in black intellectual inferiority, despite daily evidence to the contrary: the enslaved craftsmen who built their houses with sophisticated engineering, the cooks who managed complex chemical processes in kitchens, the field hands who kept precise mental accounts of work completed and compensation owed. The cognitive dissonance required to simultaneously depend on black people's abilities, while denying they possessed those abilities, has been identified as a characteristic feature of oppressive systems, a necessary mental gymnastics that allows exploitation to continue while maintaining the exploiter's self-image as moral and justified. This research has applications beyond historical understanding of slavery, helping explain contemporary phenomena like the model minority myth applied to Asian Americans, or employer preferences for immigrant labor, while simultaneously claiming immigrants take jobs from real Americans, patterns where the competence of marginalized groups is acknowledged when useful but denied when acknowledging it would challenge hierarchical structures. The medical establishment's reckoning with its complicity in slavery, prompted partly by Elias's case, but also by broader historical investigation into unethical experimentation, has been slow and incomplete. The American Medical Association issued a formal apology in 2008 for its historical support of slavery and the use of enslaved people as experimental subjects, acknowledging that modern medical knowledge had been built in part on evidence gathered through procedures conducted without consent and often with deliberate cruelty. The AMA committed to examining ways to address ongoing health disparities that trace their origins to slavery's legacy: higher maternal mortality rates among black women, lower life expectancy, reduced access to quality care, persistent bias in pain assessment and treatment. But critics noted that apologies without material reparations rang hollow, that acknowledging historical wrongs while resisting policies like universal health care that would actually improve outcomes for descendants of enslaved people suggested the apology was more about managing reputation than genuinely confronting complicity. Medical schools began incorporating medical ethics training that explicitly addressed the history of experimentation on enslaved people, using cases like Elias's to illustrate how scientific inquiry could be corrupted by ideology and how physicians' duty to their patients had to supersede broader social pressures to maintain unjust systems. But students also noted that these historical lessons often failed to connect to contemporary issues. Pharmaceutical companies testing drugs primarily on white populations, then marketing them to everyone, research funding that prioritized diseases affecting wealthy patients over conditions disproportionately impacting poor communities, the persistent gap in how pain was assessed and treated across racial lines. For black communities, Elias's story resonated in deeply personal ways. Parents saw their own children's potential reflected in his brilliance and their own fears reflected in his fate. The knowledge that excellence could be dangerous when it challenged powerful people's assumptions, that being twice as good to get half as far wasn't just a cliché, but a survival strategy born from centuries of having achievements dismissed or punished. Teachers in underfunded urban schools found inspiration in Elias's ability to learn despite being systematically denied education, using his example to motivate students who felt the system was designed for them to fail. At the same time, they cautioned against the toxic narrative that individual brilliance alone could overcome structural oppression, reminding students that Elias's genius hadn't saved him. That talent without power was vulnerable to those who felt threatened by it. That real change required collective action to dismantle systems rather than hoping exceptional individuals could transcend them. Organizations dedicated to closing educational achievement gaps invoked Elias's name while pushing for policy changes, increased school funding, teacher training addressing implicit bias, curriculum reforms incorporating black history, elimination of tracking systems that funneled black students into lower-level courses, holistic admissions policies recognizing that standardized test scores measured opportunity as much as ability. The argument was straightforward. If an enslaved man with no formal education could demonstrate genius, imagine what millions of black children could achieve, given the resources and support that white students took for granted. The artistic response to Elias's story has been rich and varied. In 2012, playwright Tarell Alvin McCraney premiered a drama titled The Genius in Chains that reimagined Elias's final days, exploring not just his intellectual gifts, but his interior emotional life, his love for Celia, his rage at his circumstances, his struggle to maintain his humanity in a system designed to strip it away, his final defiant recitation of everything he'd learned as Dr. Knott drilled into his skull. The play was controversial for its explicit depiction of the trepanation scene, with some critics arguing it was gratuitously violent and others countering that sanitizing slavery's brutality did disservice to its victims. A 2015 novel by poet Jesmyn Ward used Elias's story as a framework for exploring contemporary educational inequality, paralleling his experience with a modern black prodigy navigating a school system that alternately celebrated and punished his excellence. Visual artists created works inspired by Elias, paintings depicting him surrounded by mathematical equations and musical notes, while chains bound his wrists, sculptures showing his head opened to reveal not brain matter but books and telescopes, and all the knowledge he'd accumulated despite every attempt to deny him access to learning. A hip-hop concept album released in 2018 by a collective of black musicians used Elias's life as a meditation on genius and systemic oppression, with tracks titled Brain Fever and Trepanation and The Wooden Bird that wove together historical references and contemporary commentary on how talent in black bodies was still seen as threatening by those invested in maintaining racial hierarchies. Academic institutions have struggled with how to honor Elias's memory while acknowledging their own historical complicity in the ideologies that killed him. Charleston Medical College, now part of a larger university system, established the Elias Brooks Center for Bioethics in 2005, dedicating it to studying ethical issues in human subjects research, with particular attention to how vulnerable populations had been and continued to be exploited. The center's first major project was a comprehensive investigation into medical experimentation conducted on enslaved people throughout the antebellum South, documenting hundreds of cases where black bodies had been used to advance medical knowledge without consent and often without any effort to minimize suffering or preserve life. The resulting report, published in 2008, ran to over 800 pages and included recommendations for how modern medicine should address this legacy through memorial services acknowledging victims, through curricular changes ensuring medical students understood this history, through research priorities that addressed health disparities rooted in slavery's aftermath, and through community engagement that rebuilt trust with black patients who had every reason to be suspicious of medical establishments that had betrayed them so thoroughly. Some critics argued the center represented an attempt to launder the medical school's reputation without meaningfully changing power structures, noting that its advisory board was predominantly white and that its research funding came largely from pharmaceutical companies with their own troubling records regarding exploitation of vulnerable populations in clinical trials. But others saw it as a genuine, if imperfect, effort to grapple with difficult history, to use institutional resources to correct some of the harm those institutions had caused. The question of what contemporary society owes to Elias Brooks and the millions like him whose potential was destroyed by slavery remains contentious. Reparations advocates point to his case as exemplifying the broader theft slavery represented, not just of labor and of bodies, but of human potential, of contributions to human knowledge and culture that were prevented from ever existing. How do you calculate the value of a genius who never got to fulfill his promise, they ask, or the compound interest on centuries of unpaid labor, or the ongoing costs of health disparities and educational inequality that trace directly to slavery's legacy? Opponents of reparations argue that contemporary white Americans bear no responsibility for crimes committed by ancestors they may not even be descended from, that correcting historical injustices through present-day transfers would be impractical and divisive, that other solutions like improved education and economic opportunity programs would be more effective and less controversial. But reparations supporters counter that this framing misunderstands the issue, that it's not about punishing today's white people for their ancestors' sins, but rather about acknowledging that contemporary wealth and poverty have historical roots, that advantages compound over generations just as disadvantages do, that addressing inequality requires recognizing its causes not as individual failures, but as structural barriers built over centuries and maintained through active effort. Elias's story makes the abstract concrete. Here was a man whose labor enriched his master while he lived, and whose death was covered up to protect theories that justified continued exploitation. His descendants received nothing from his brilliance, no inheritance, no educational opportunities, no compensation for what was stolen. Meanwhile, Colonel Whitmore's descendants inherited land and wealth built on Elias's exploitation and that of thousands of other enslaved people, advantages that opened doors and created opportunities that compounded over generations into the kind of comfortable circumstances that allow people to believe success is purely a matter of individual merit rather than accumulated privilege. In the end, Elias Brooks's story serves as a stark reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living force that shapes contemporary reality in ways we often prefer not to acknowledge. His brilliant mind, his murdered body, his stolen potential, these are not just tragic footnotes to American history, but indictments of systems and ideologies that persist in modified forms, that continue to insist some people are naturally superior to others, that continue to deny opportunity while blaming those denied for their own lack of achievement, that continue to suppress evidence threatening to comfortable narratives about meritocracy and fairness. To truly honor Elias's memory requires more than memorial services and scholarships and centers named in his honor. It requires commitment to the kind of truth-telling he died for, acknowledgement of the lies that justified his murder, and active dismantling of every structure built on the premise that some human lives matter less than others. It requires looking unflinchingly at how genius and talent and potential have been systematically destroyed when they appeared in bodies deemed wrong by those holding power, and choosing differently, choosing to nurture rather than fear excellence wherever it appears, choosing to revise theories when they conflict with evidence rather than destroying the evidence, choosing truth over comfort and justice over convenience. That would be a memorial worthy of a man who was extraordinary, not because he transcended his humanity, but because he embodied its fullest possibilities, a man whose mind defied every false scientific explanation for inequality, proving through his very existence that the only limits on human achievement are the ones we impose through cruelty, ignorance, and fear. Elias Brooks proved in 1848 that enslaved people could be geniuses, and was murdered for it by doctors who chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, showing us that the fight against systemic racism has always required confronting how institutions suppress evidence threatening their power. Subscribe to uncover more hidden histories that textbooks buried, like If This Story Changed How You See American History, and comment how we should honor the countless brilliant minds destroyed by systems designed to crush them.